But this level of usage is probably one of the reasons why we're seeing declining labor force participation. Now, back to the sort of question, what are these people doing? Well, one way or another, society's taking care of them. The family is doing it, it's a charity, it's the government. They end up in jail, they're on street corners, but they are a cost to society. Falling labor force participation is almost like 10, 15 years ago when I talked to you about sea level rise. It's really an important problem because it is impacting economic growth. It is a cost. It's a social problem for families and the like. We have to figure out why labor force participation has been falling and then, again, figure out ways to counter it. Now, as an economist, we think of incentives and penalties and things like that as ways to achieve this, but it's a complex problem. I want to end up by talking a little bit about affordability and access in Virginia public higher education. And I'll start you out with this slide, which shows over the last 15 years the increase in tuition and fees at Virginia public institutions. And this big guy here is William & Mary at 344%. This little green thing, that's this consumer price index. So William & Mary has increased his tuition about 10 times as much as the consumer price index. Now, universities will tell you that they face some unusual costs for technology and people, and I think that's basically correct, but that's the higher education price index, 53%. Okay? Now, even Old Dominion, which is the lowest one on the graph, is 150%. This is Christopher Newport, 319%. What about the community colleges? Well, basically the same answer. Now their prices are lower, but they've been raising those lower prices pretty rapidly. And here's TCC, here's Thomas Nelson, here's Eastern Shore Community College, and the big guy here is Northern Virginia Community College. They're increasing their prices rather rapidly as well. Now, the story always is, well, the state cut our money. And there's truth to that. It's just that it's not the whole story. House Appropriations Committee found that they increased tuition roughly $2 for every dollar that they got cut. Okay. Ultimately, it gets down to affordability. Tuition and fees have gone up almost 10 times as rapidly as median household income. People simply can't afford to go to school. And this is maybe a simpler way to see this. Think of the average wage rate earned by a Virginian. Think of the average level of tuition and fees. Back in 2001, it took 227 hours of work to pay for tuition and fees. Now it's 438. It's 234 at the community colleges.
And that's not counting the debt if you borrow the money and then there's
Yes.
the debt.
One of the implications, of course, is debt, but you look at this graph and we're simply pricing people out of higher education. So people go into debt. And when they go into debt, and these are all really reputable economic studies, they don't buy houses, they don't buy cars, they end up living with their parents. When you look at last year's graduating class, more than 35% of them now are living at home. I don't think it's because they love their parents or their parents love them. It's more than 35% are living at home. And this is a reflection of debt, of economic circumstances, and the like.
And Dr. Cook, as someone who's experiencing this, you are right. The drain on the amount of my money that would be disposable income that's now subsidizing my daughter and her daughter is consuming that, and I'm not spending it in the local economy.
Yes.
So there's that extra impact because of that.
Our kids are continuing obligations, let's put it that way. Now, if you'd like the data that you've seen here, this is the web address to go to. And if you want a copy of the slides, send me an email and then I'll send you the slides. And at this point, I'm going to ask Bob to come up with.
Can you put that back up?
Yes.
I need to get the address. Thank you.
That's the Center for Economic Analysis and Policy, which is now the Graduate Center.
And is your email up there somewhere that?
I am jkoch@odu.edu.
Okay, thank you.
So jkoch@odu.edu, and we'll send you this stuff if you'd like to have it.
Thank you.
And in fact, since it's already on this computer, if you download it onto the computer, that's one way to capture it.
Okay.
And all the difficult questions go to him.
Well, is there, why is this not on television? Why is this not something where there's a show on Channel 10 or 13? This information is something everybody needs to hear. Is there some way to get this on a broader public awareness?
Well, we go around and do things like this. This is my 4th presentation this week. I did the Norfolk Rotary, the Chesapeake Rotary. We did some financial institutions last night. Bob's met with the Virginian Pilot editorial board. We do all those kinds of things, and I write op-eds. I mean, we've been in the
Okay.
Times Dispatch, the Roanoke Times. I'm not just in the New York Times, but I got to say that a lot of the people we want to influence don't read these things.
Right.
They don't even take a newspaper. And so
But everyday people who live here need to know everything you just said.
it's a challenge though now with the change in media and so forth. How do you get at the audience?
Okay.
And some of the things that I'm saying here are not popular on my own campus. And Bob can tell you, he has to fend off.
Citizen jobs.
Yes.
Do you have one on government jobs, you know, state, local, and stuff like that to promote
That's what we
that
can
as
produce.
well?
Yeah, that's easy to produce. Public sector jobs in Hampton Roads have actually declined slightly. The federal workforce in Hampton Roads is actually quite large. It's around 40,000 people. And the federal workforce tends to be higher educated, tends to have higher skills, and thus you end up needing to pay them higher wages. That's why average federal wages tend to be higher than the private sector. You just can't compare them on average. You have to look at comparable jobs. And if you look at comparable jobs, the federal workforce, especially at the higher end, pays less than the private sector. If we start thinking information technology, doctors, etc. So what's happened is not only have we seen a decline in the civilian labor force relative to 2015, for example, the federal workforce has declined slightly. The state workforce has remained about the same, and the number of active duty military stationed in Hampton Roads has declined slightly also. So you essentially have a declining civilian workforce and public sector workforce, and that in part on the private sector side is attributable to the lack of job generation, and on the federal government side is attributable to the spending caps that are currently in place.
And Bob, thank you for being here today. When you show the sequestrations, of course, you know they're looking at raising those caps. Do you have any idea that for every $10 billion of additional top-line DOD spending, that translates to X percent, and Hampton Roads and translates to X percent change in GDP?
And so it's tricky to answer, and the reason it's tricky to answer is because it's a mixture of funding. It's if, for example, the DOD lays on a procurement for another carrier out of that increase in the cap, then Hampton Roads direct DOD spending will just, increase by 10 to 12 billion. But if they don't, if they funnel it primarily into operations and personnel, then it's a much lower percentage. So let me jump back. So the current negotiations among the leadership at the Hill right now is for a $250 billion increase in the cap over 2 years, which is a large increase. And in fact, the most recent agreed to appropriations bill between the House and the Senate that is waiting for these caps to increase to move forward only has a $54 billion increase in defense, and they're talking about raising the cap by 70+ billion. So if that happens, we would expect probably, I would hazard a guess, at least 2 to 5 billion of that to come to us. And if procurement is laid on the line for shipbuilding, then that'll increase significantly. The big worry is that this is a 2-year agreement, and the costs of tax reform near the end of that agreement will become much more apparent in terms of the increases in the federal deficit. So you have to be concerned that this will be a temporary spike followed by another level of round of stagnation or actual decline in defense expenditures.
Yeah, I would add to that our college student kids may be living in our neighborhoods, but we are making them pay for this.
In debt.
Yes.
So the thing I thought was interesting that I didn't see in this presentation, in the private sector where I work, and also in the government paying, what's really killing all of this is the exponential explosion in the cost of healthcare, medical benefits, healthcare insurance. And as you talk about these caps, what's really happening, exacerbating this problem, I have Sailor or Soldier or Airman Jones. And if you mapped what the cost was to the government to provide that health care at the equivalent level, that's consuming so much more. And in our private sector, we are reducing our number of employees, increasing the hours that our employees work because we can't afford the cost of that medical coverage as the percent of what my company has to pay per employee, which is depressing the number of people. Our actual work has doubled, but our employment growth is 25% of that, and we're doing it with extra hours in labor to not do that. So my point is, what would be helpful in here is to understand the economic driver of healthcare cost explosion as it's consuming that available profitability for growth.
Well, it's certainly happening in the military. And again, I'm not going to argue against it, but that's causing them not to be able to spend money on other things.
Right.
The whole healthcare thing is very complicated. But it will suffice, I think, for me to say that healthcare markets are not competitive markets in the same fashion, in the same way that, let's say, the market for computers or automobiles and things like that are. Is very different, and therefore some of the things that you would say, gee, I'd like to make this market more competitive, don't work because the markets are so different. And I mean, I hesitate to say this in this room, but because I would have never said it 10 or 20 years ago, but I'm beginning to think that in some cases we're going to have to go to price controls to deal with some of these circumstances, because typical competitive solutions are not likely to get the job done. And just to point out one sort of problem we have, it's sort of the free rider problem. A huge portion of medical pharmaceutical research is done in the United States, and other people free ride off that. I mean, one of the reasons that prices are lower, one reason in Canada, is that they don't have to pay for, well, good, they take a readout and then they price control it and sell it at a lower price. Now, how do you deal with that? Well, that's tough, isn't it? I mean, we don't have any control over the Canadian government or what they're doing in Germany and places like that. And I could go on and on, but there are half a dozen ways in which this market is not quite so amenable to some of the things that we would ordinarily do. We'd say, well, we're going to make this more competitive, we're going to increase the supply of doctors, we're going to do this and that, and it's a tough situation, but it's eating us alive.
So let me follow up with this one point that I wanted to share with you. I've been learning a lot as my daughter, she's 21, has a child, and is moving out into the real world, so to speak. through this safety net that you talked about, she pays nothing, but she has 100% of all of her medical costs and everything that she wants paid for by the government, by taxpayers, by other government programs. Her daughter has 100% paid. Basically, my daughter has better medical coverage than I do. Meanwhile, my cost of my share has gone up about 400% in the last 5 years, but the deductibles are so high, I have no medical care. I cannot afford to use it because my deductible exceeds what it would cost me to pay it out of pocket. But I'm mandated to pay this massive percentage of my income for insurance that I cannot use. So I'm telling you, the safety net that you talked about are the people who are getting out of the labor force. The message to my daughter is, don't work. Don't stay at home and live with mom and dad and don't work, because the cost to be taking care of your baby and yourself for medical and all the rest of it is so high, it's free if I don't. And so that behavior is a direct result of depressing perfectly qualified, capable individuals from being employed. I just want to kind of throw that out there.
Well, you're making a perfect argument for universal coverage, right? And as much as people don't like hearing it, if we look at other industrialized countries around the world, why do they put everybody in the risk pool? Because as we continue to segment the market, right, if we think of a big health insurance market, and what does it characterize? Well, one problem is it's characterized by asymmetric information, right? You have health information you don't want to disclose to your health insurance provider, because if you disclose that, your rates may go up. It's characterized by moral hazard, right? If we insure you, you might engage in riskier activities. It's characterized by the externalities that you just discussed, right? If we allow some people to have coverage that's subsidized by the government and some people that don't, we can actually create disincentives for it.
We did.
And here's another problem. You've heard the discussion, well, we need competition across state lines. Well, the problem with competition across state lines is that you may have people who are geographically not mobile, and so I buy a policy in Virginia Beach, but that policy is issued out of Louisiana, which has much lower regulation, much higher deductibles. What's my recourse? Do I go to the Virginia Insurance Commission? Do I go to Louisiana? And so that becomes very problematic. So you have to think about it. We have to look at this systemically, right? This is a systemic problem, and it actually comes in part out of how we dealt with wage controls in World War II. With wage controls in World War II, how do we actually remunerate, how do we compensate individuals? One part of the compensation of individuals was through fringe benefits. Just looping this back around to close the entire conversation entirely, one of the things we're not really talking about as a society is health insurance costs as a threat to national security. The most significant expenditure that we are facing in terms of increased costs for the DoD is benefits. It's health care. We think that you think that F-35 is bad in terms of health cost increases. Health insurance is the one that's eating the Pentagon alive. And especially why? Think about it. If I was in the Army, it's a great deal. You serve 20, you get out, you get TRICARE for life. The problem is the civilian costs are rapidly increasing. TRICARE for life is essentially mandated by Congress in terms of the deductibility and premiums. And you know what happens anytime DoD comes back and says, hey, we need to adjust the premiums because the costs are rising, just is a political non-starter. So the DoD is having to fund an increasingly larger amount of expenditure to keep TRICARE for life at the current premiums.
And that was the reason I asked the question, because I didn't see that piece of, that's a significant piece of data that I didn't really see addressed in the slides, and it'd be interesting to see that data increase graphed against these other issues to see how much is that depressing our economic growth, not only in the region but nationally, and also exacerbating this issue with, what was the term you used, the people that are out of the labor market because they gave up? what do you call it?
Discouraged workers.
Discouraged workers. I think those two